As if anything had changed at all, she simply walked through the halls as if he were invisible, and for the first time in his life Brandon Whitaker felt what it was like to be powerless. Malcolm Brooker never called again. He didn't need to. The lesson had already been taught. Brandon Whitaker had been removed from the game, and in doing so a new rule had been written in the unspoken laws of Roosevelt Middle School. Naomi Brooks was not to be touched ever. She had won without ever lifting a finger, and in the world Malcolm Brooks had built, that was the kind of power that lasted. But the effects of that night didn't just stop at Roosevelt. The senator, normally a man who walked into every meeting with an air of invincibility, suddenly looked older, more cautious. He began turning down public events, retreating into private meetings, as if he suddenly understood that he had been playing in a world far more dangerous than politics. His political rivals sensed it, though none of them knew why. The media speculated about health issues, stress, scandal, but the truth was simpler. He had been reminded that there were powers greater than money, greater than votes. For Brandon Whitaker, life never returned to what it was. He tried to regain control, tried to act like nothing had changed, but the school had already moved on. The kids who had once followed him blindly now hesitated, uncertain. His best friend Zach Coleman, once his closest ally, stopped sitting with him at lunch. Teachers who had once feared reprimanding him now seemed indifferent, as if his last name had lost its weight. Even at home his father had little patience for him anymore. Conversations were short-clipped, and for the first time Brandon Whitaker felt like a liability instead of an asset. And Naomi Brooks, she continued on, untouched, unbothered, unshaken. She never looked for revenge. She never tried to get back at him, because she had never needed to. One afternoon months later, Brandon Whitaker found himself standing by his locker, staring at nothing in particular, lost in thought. He hadn't spoken to Naomi Brooks since that day. He hadn't dared, but as she passed him in the hallway, for the briefest moment their eyes met, there was no malice in her gaze, no gloating, no lingering satisfaction, just that same steady, unreadable expression she had always worn. And somehow that made it worse, because Brandon Whitaker realized something then: she had never been afraid of him, not once, not for a second. He had spent his whole life believing that power was something that could be taken, controlled, wielded, but Malcolm Brooks had taught him the truth in a single night. Real power didn't need to announce itself, it simply existed. And now Brandon Whitaker understood. He had never been the predator, he had always been the prey. Sometimes, the strongest power doesn't come from fists or fame, but from knowing who truly stands behind you. Naomi didn't fight back, because she didn't have to. Her quiet strength spoke louder than any outburst ever could, and in a world that often rewards loudness, that kind of silence is revolutionary. But here's a question for you. Should someone's background determine how they're treated? Or better yet, would Tyler have backed off if Naomi hadn't had a powerful grandfather? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you see the world differently, then don't just scroll. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to Soulful Stories V. Because the truth is, some stories aren't just meant to be told. They're meant to be felt. His voice almost a whisper. Then come to school tomorrow. Let's see who shows up. The next morning was unusually cold for late September. Jalen Carter wore a black hoodie and jeans as he walked to school. Students were already buzzing before first period, congregating near the front entrance. Something was happening. A deep rumble echoed through the street. Heads turned. A sleek black Dodge Charger rolled up the curb, its paint gleaming like obsidian. The driver's window slowly lowered. There he was. Troy Maxwell. Students gasped. A few dropped their phones. Kyle's jaw went slack. Jalen Carter didn't make a scene. He calmly walked to the car, opened the passenger door, and climbed in. Troy Maxwell looked over, nodded once, and said, "You okay, kid?" Jalen Carter smiled faintly. "Yeah, just wanted to clear something up." The Charger idled for a moment before pulling away. Behind them, the front of Central Valley Middle School buzzed like a hornet's nest. That afternoon, Troy Maxwell met with the school principal behind closed doors. No one knew what was said, but by the end of the day, Bryce Dalton had been called out of class, and his friends no longer walked with the same arrogance. Word traveled fast. Jalen Carter wasn't just some quiet new kid. He had people, real ones. And more than that, he had patience, resilience, and something no bully could stand against: dignity. The buzz didn't die down for days. Teachers pretended not to notice the stares Jalen Carter got, the whispered exchanges between students, or the awkward way Bryce Dalton now walked through the halls, avoiding eye contact. For the first time in years, the king of Central Valley Middle School had been knocked off his pedestal. Not by a fight, not by a scandal, but by quiet dignity wrapped in unshakable truth. And it wasn't just about the car or the man who stepped out of it. It was the way Jalen Carter carried himself before and after, as if he didn't need the spectacle to prove who he was, that disturbed Bryce Dalton more than anything. At lunch, Jalen Carter took his usual seat at the far edge of the cafeteria. He still sat alone, but it didn't feel the same. People glanced at him, not with mockery, but with something closer to respect or confusion. Some of the kids who had laughed before were now silent. A few even nodded his way. Jalen Carter didn't care for the attention, but he recognized the shift. Power in a place like middle school was fluid. Respect didn't come from popularity. It came from principle. And people were beginning to understand that. Kyle, however, wasn't ready to let go. Humiliation festered in his chest like a growing flame. His world was one of dominance. Football locker room hierarchy, weekend lake parties where his dad's money kept everything loud and wild. He couldn't afford to be the guy who got put in his place by the quiet kid with the famous uncle. So, he did what cowards do when pride is wounded. He lashed out from the shadows. The next day, Jalen Carter opened his locker to find a printout taped to the inside. A photoshopped image crudely done of him in prison stripes with fake headlines that read, "Vin's nephew busted for lying." At the bottom scribbled in red marker, "Guess fame runs in the family. So does jail." Jalen Carter peeled it off slowly, folded it once, and placed it in his pocket. He didn't react. Around him, a few students glanced his way, unsure what to say. He walked to class like nothing happened. That evening, over spaghetti and garlic bread, his mom asked how school was. He looked at her, thought about telling her everything, then shook his head and smiled. "It's fine. Just learning who people really are." At night, Jalen Carter lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He thought about Vin's words as they rode away that day. "You don't fight fire with fire. You let it burn out when no one feeds it." He understood now. Bryce Dalton was feeding the fire alone. And that kind of fire always devours its maker. Still, he wasn't naive. Bryce Dalton would escalate, and Jalen Carter needed to be ready, not for a physical fight, but something much more strategic. So, he paid attention. He noticed things. How Bryce Dalton treated his so-called friends, how he flirted with girls, then mocked them behind their backs, how he bragged about his dad's dealership, but never invited anyone over. He watched the way Bryce Dalton handled pressure, how his jokes got darker when his popularity dipped, how he always needed someone to look down on to feel tall. The final straw came 2 weeks later. Jalen Carter arrived at school to find a small crowd gathered near the library entrance. There on the bulletin board were screenshots, dozens of them printed out and pinned for all to see. Texts from Bryce Dalton leaked from a group chat he had with his teammates. There were jokes about classmates, racist, sexist, cruel, ugly things said behind the backs of kids he smiled at daily. Even Coach Reynolds' name was mentioned in a not-so-flattering light. No one knew who had leaked them, but it didn't matter. The damage was nuclear. Bryce Dalton arrived late that day. By the time he stepped into the hallway and saw the wall of shame, it was too late. Students parted like the Red Sea, watching him in silence. Some took photos. A few snickered. Most just stared, stunned by the mask that had finally slipped. Kyle's eyes darted to Jalen Carter, who stood quietly at his locker, placing books into his backpack. No expression, no gloating, just stillness. That made it worse. Bryce Dalton stormed down the hallway, tore the papers from the wall, and crumpled them in his fists. "Who did this? Who the hell did this?" he shouted. But no one answered. Not even his friends, if they could still be called that. By lunch, Bryce Dalton sat alone for the first time in his life. No one laughed at his jokes. No one shared their chips. Even the teachers seemed to look at him differently. Jalen Carter took his tray and walked past him without a glance, but Bryce Dalton couldn't let it go. That afternoon, he waited for Jalen Carter by the bike racks. His face was flushed, his fists clenched. When Jalen Carter stepped into the cool autumn light, Bryce Dalton blocked his path. "This is your fault," he hissed. "You think you're better than me just because you've got some movie star for an uncle?" Jalen Carter looked him dead in the eye. "No," he said quietly. "I think I'm better than who you pretend to be." Bryce Dalton shoved him hard, but Jalen Carter didn't stumble. He stood his ground. "You don't get it," Bryce Dalton said. "This isn't over." "It is," Jalen Carter replied. "You just don't know it yet." Bryce Dalton didn't hit him. He couldn't. Not with 3 teachers watching from a distance and half the school still buzzing from the morning's revelations. Instead, he turned and walked away, fast, fists still clenched, shoulders tight with rage. That night, Jalen Carter sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set behind the hills. His mom sat beside him, sipping chamomile tea. He finally told her everything. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she nodded once and placed her hand on his. "You're your father's son," she whispered. He never raised his voice, but the room always listened. The next morning, a new energy hummed through the school. Bryce Dalton wasn't suspended, but word was he'd been removed from the football team. His father had been called in for a long, tense meeting with the principal. Some of the screenshots had found their way online. Parents were involved now. Reputation meant something in a place like Springfield. Kyle's was in free fall. Jalen Carter noticed the shift in air as he walked through the halls. People didn't whisper anymore. They nodded, said hello, asked if he wanted to join them for lunch. Some were still wary, unsure what to make of him. That was fine. Respect earned slowly was always stronger. Later that week, as he sat under the tree behind the gym, Troy Maxwell pulled up in the Charger. No dramatic entrance this time, just a soft engine and a smile. Jalen Carter climbed in. "How was your week?" Troy Maxwell asked. "Interesting," Jalen Carter said. Troy Maxwell chuckled. "You didn't even touch the kid." Jalen Carter looked out the window, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Didn't have to." Troy Maxwell drove off, the sun catching the edge of the hood, casting a golden glare that danced across the pavement. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. Victory didn't always look like a trophy or a fight won. Sometimes it looked like keeping your peace while the rest of the world fell apart around someone who deserved it. Over the next few weeks, life at Central Valley Middle School found a new rhythm. The storm that had centered around Bryce Dalton slowly dissipated, leaving behind the kind of silence that comes after a wildfire. Still a little smoky, but clearing. The school no longer revolved around his moods, his jokes, or his approval. Students walked the halls without the constant undercurrent of fear or judgment. Jalen Carter noticed the difference in how people carried themselves. Shoulders were less hunched, laughter more genuine. Even teachers seemed lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. Bryce Dalton still came to school, but he was quieter, smaller somehow. He walked alone now, backpack slung low, baseball cap pulled down over his face. A few kids still talked to him, but mostly out of habit, not loyalty. The hierarchy had shifted, and while Jalen Carter hadn't taken Kyle's place at the top, he had become something much rarer, respected without needing to dominate. What struck Jalen Carter most wasn't the change in Kyle, but the change in himself. For so long, he had moved through schools like a shadow, never staying long enough to grow roots. But here in this small town, surrounded by kids who once mocked and now watched him with quiet recognition, he had begun to feel something unfamiliar, grounded. He joined the debate club after Ms. Green encouraged him. At first he was hesitant, unsure if his voice would carry the same strength in public speaking as it had in quiet defiance. But during the first practice, when he stood in front of the room and spoke with clarity and conviction, even the upperclassmen stopped to listen. His topic was leadership through integrity. And though he never mentioned names, everyone knew who he was talking about. Afterward, a boy named Trevor Banks patted his back and said, "Dude, that was powerful." Jalen Carter just smiled and nodded. At home, his mother seemed more at peace. She no longer asked about school with that worried edge in her voice. Instead, they talked about books, weekend plans, and sometimes the future. One evening, as they sat on the porch sharing a bowl of popcorn, she looked over and said, "You're growing into someone real strong, Eli. Your uncle would be proud." Jalen Carter didn't answer right away. He thought about Vin, about the ride in the Charger, the firm voice that said, "You okay, kid?" and the quiet understanding in his eyes. "He helped," Jalen Carter finally said. "But it wasn't about him. It was about choosing who I want to be." Troy Maxwell called a few days later just to check in. "You still keeping that chin up?" he asked. Jalen Carter laughed softly. "Yeah, I'm doing all right." Troy Maxwell paused for a beat, then added, "You know, sometimes the loudest statement you can make is saying nothing at all. But what you did, that was more than silence. That was strength with direction." Jalen Carter didn't quite know how to respond, but something in his chest felt warmer after that. The school year rolled on. Halloween decorations went up in the hallways. The leaves outside turned from bright orange to dry brown, and the air got crisp with early frost. Jalen Carter found himself invited to birthday parties, study groups, even a Saturday movie night with some kids from the debate team. It wasn't about popularity. It was connection. Real connection built slowly and quietly like trust. Kyle, meanwhile, remained a cautionary tale. The kind teachers brought up subtly in lessons about respect and consequences. A poster even appeared in the hallway one day, anonymous but clear. "Power built on fear collapses with truth." No one said Jalen Carter wrote it, and he never confirmed. He didn't need to. Some things didn't require credit to make an impact. One Friday afternoon, a substitute gym teacher let the kids play basketball freely. Bryce Dalton was shooting hoops alone when the ball rolled toward Jalen Carter. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, then walked over and handed it back. Bryce Dalton muttered, "Thanks," without making eye contact. Jalen Carter nodded. "You used to be good at this," he said quietly. Bryce Dalton looked up, confused. Jalen Carter continued, "Maybe you still are. Just got lost somewhere in all that noise." Then he walked away, leaving Bryce Dalton standing there, ball in hand, unsure how to respond. It wasn't forgiveness. Not exactly. But it wasn't hatred either. It was something more mature, an invitation to grow, or at least a refusal to carry bitterness. A few weeks later at the Winter Talent Show, Jalen Carter stood backstage with his notes in hand. He was the final act of the night, delivering a spoken-word piece titled The Measure of a Voice. The gym was packed, parents, teachers, students. When his name was called, he walked out, the mic waiting in the center of the stage. He looked out at the faces, took a breath, and began. His voice was steady, soft, but deliberate. "They told me silence was safer than truth. That shrinking made you invisible, and invisible meant protected. But I've learned that silence only shelters the storm. That truth once spoken moves like wind, unstoppable. I've seen bullies rise on thrones of noise. And I've seen those thrones crumble under the weight of a whisper. I've learned that dignity doesn't shout. It listens. It watches. It waits. And when the time comes, it speaks not to win, but to remind the world who we are when no one's watching." The room was silent, then applause, slow at first, then rising, not just polite, but powerful. A standing ovation. Jalen Carter stepped back from the mic, nodded once, and walked off stage. He didn't look for validation in the crowd. He didn't need to. After the show, his mom hugged him tighter than she ever had. Troy Maxwell was there too, having driven all the way from St. Louis just to see it live. He clapped Jalen Carter on the back, a proud smile in his eyes. "Told you," he said. "You don't need muscles or movies to be strong." That night, as snow began to fall in light flakes over Springfield, Jalen Carter looked out his bedroom window. The world seemed softer, clearer. He thought about where he'd started, how close he'd come to disappearing into the background again, but he hadn't. He'd faced the storm, endured the noise, and waited for the truth to speak. And when it did, it spoke through him. Not loud, not angry, but with a quiet certainty that couldn't be denied. Because in the end, he didn't beat the bully. He outgrew him. And that made all the difference. In the end, Jalen Carter didn't win because he had a famous uncle. He won because he refused to lose himself. In a world where bullies shout to be seen and lies spread faster than truth, it was Jalen's quiet strength, his patience, his self-respect, that changed everything. And while Troy Maxwell may have turned heads when he arrived, it was Jalen's dignity that made people listen. But let's ask the real question. Would people have taken Jalen seriously if Troy hadn't shown up? Was it the presence of power, or the power of presence, that made the difference? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. And if you believe in stories that uplift, challenge, and reveal the power in quiet courage. Hit that like button, subscribe to Soulful Stories V, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment that matters. Because sometimes, the smallest voices carry the biggest truths.